My name is Vivian Henry. I'm from Minnesota. I'm one of the 1.8 million people in the state forced to live in poverty. I'm pissed as hell because I shouldn't have to be here today because poverty is a policy choice in the richest nation in the world. I battle 4 mental health challenges that have been extremely debilitating in most of my adult life. For the past 7 years, I've had to battle many times for Social Security disability. I survive on just $585 a month from state general assistance and food stamps. If I didn't live in public housing, I would be homeless. General assistance wasn't raised during COVID and hasn't increased with inflation. Recently, I started donating plasma because I don't have enough money to meet my basic needs. This is immoral to be forced to live this way. The state of Minnesota has declared me disabled 3 times, but that doesn't automatically approve me for Social Security disability. This is asinine. How can I be declared disabled by the state only to have the federal government deny me benefits? I had breast cancer scare in 2018, and now I need a 3D mammogram and breast MRI each year for the rest of my life. But I fear losing my Medicaid due to the lack of consciousness of many politicians who could care less about whether I live or die. I'm here to say that if Congress can repeatedly afford to give corporate welfare to the rich, then Congress can afford universal health care for all. So that people don't go bankrupt or are forced to use a GoFundMe to cover medical expenses. Scarcity is a massive lie. This is why we're here. We won't be silent anymore.
Thank you. Give it up. Give it up. Let me welcome you from all over the country and all over the state to this mass mobilization and urgent call to action. If we never needed to vote, if we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. First 5 stops, beginning on August 26th all the way through the 29th, we will be engaging in a mass mobilization organizing tour of the 14 congressional districts in North Carolina. You just heard one of our speakers from June 18th that represented hundreds of people who joined more than 150,000 people during COVID on June 18th for the mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington to the polls, who declared not only will we not be silent anymore, but that we will vote like never before. Tonight, I want to lay out for you the foundational message of why we are in this moment. Following me, there will be folk who will testify from their perspective as to why they're not so much focused on personality and party, but positions and principles and policies as it relates to how this country and this state deals with the issues of poor, low wealth, and low wage people. Let me ask our sound person just to bring some of the echo out of this microphone that we're hearing so that you can hear me clearly, both in here and online. And we will see you tomorrow in Greensboro, North Carolina at 12 o'clock at the great Zion Baptist Church, and then tomorrow night in Wilmington, and then a national sermon on Sunday morning, which is the anniversary of the death of Emmett Till and the anniversary of the March on Washington. And then on Monday, we will see you at the Union Baptist Church in Winston Salem, North Carolina. In the testimony circle of my faith tradition, the saints used to declare, if we ever needed the Lord, we sure do need the Lord now. Tonight, like a hip-hop artist, I want to sample from that faith tradition and say, if we ever needed to vote for justice, for democracy, for equality, we sure do need to vote now. For us, the right to vote is not a partisan matter, but a right born out of struggle, out of sacrifice. Our votes are not mere support of personalities and parties or particular candidates, but our votes are demands on those parties and on those personalities that relate to policies. We live in a nation where the denial of health care, the denial of living wages, the suppression and attempt to suppress voting rights, the denial of paid family leave, even for those whom we call now necessary workers, workers who are not merely what we used to call them service workers, but workers who we have depended on, claim that they are essential now in the midst of COVID. We live in a nation where the denial of women's rights and reproductive freedom and access to public education are all policy issues. In poor and low-wage communities, we cannot merely vote based on personality or party. We must look at policy positions and how they affect our lives. Poverty is not moral failure of individuals. It is a policy failure of our society. Now, according to the biblical text, voting is a moral issue. It is a gift from God, the God of justice. Right in the book of Genesis, we find that out. For God gave humanity free will and the right to choose. That's voting. In Hebrew, the word for vote and the word for voice is the same word, koil, K-O-L. 2,600 years ago, the prophet Micah reminded us of the always urgent time when it comes to justice and equality. Those realities, those needs are always urgent. And so Micah said to every nation, if you really want to please the divine, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. The prophet Amos said, as paraphrased in the Message Bible in Amos chapter 5, seek good and not evil. That's voting. That's making a decision. Seek good and not evil and live. You talk about God, the God of the angel armies, being your best friend. In God we trust, we say. Well, Amos said 20-some hundred years ago, live like it. And the only way to live like it is to make a choice, is to make a vote. And that is a vote to hate evil and love good. Work it out in the public square. And then maybe the God of the angel armies will notice your remnant and be gracious. God told Amos to tell the people, organize. Go out into the streets and lament loudly. Fill the malls and the shops with the cries of doom. Weep loudly, not me, not now, not on our watch. Empty their offices, stores, factories, and workplaces. Enlist everyone in a general lament. I want to hear it loud and clear when I make my visit, says the Lord. Let me ask everybody to take a seat. It's difficult enough to speak without the distractions. Please take a seat. Please take a seat. Thank you. Please take a seat. Thank you. Anything we haven't done, we can't get it done now. Then Amos went on to say, I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and your conventions. I want nothing to do with your religious projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. Listen to this. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image makings. That sounds like campaign, doesn't it? I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to God anyway? You know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. And then the next line in that ancient text simply says this: woe unto you who are at ease in Zion. Woe unto you who live on Easy Street and think that you can treat other folk any kind of way and survive. Then 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, one day the nations will be judged. And the question will be asked, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you give me drink, clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? When I was homeless, did you give me a room? When I was sick, did you care about me? When I was in prison, did you come to me? And when I was an immigrant, did you welcome me? The Bible goes on to say that one group of people will say, Lord, when did we do these things? And God will say, whenever you did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. But he will say to the others, when you didn't do these things, you did not do them unto me. In North Carolina, Article 6 of our Constitution says clearly who may vote. I love to read it. I love to think about it, because it amazes me how so much attention and time and pornographic sums of money are being used to try to undermine the right to vote, when it's pretty clear. This is what it says: every person. Every person born in the United States and every person who has been naturalized, 18 years of age and possessing the qualifications set out in this article, shall be entitled to vote. Not might, not may, not until another group of politicians come in, not if you pass another law, shall be entitled to vote at any election by the people of the state. That's what the Constitution says. That's the moral principle. That's the policy. And then in Article 11, Section 4 of North Carolina's Constitution, there's one more thing that we need to hear and understand why we must center poor and low-wealth people in any policy decisions we make. Section 4 of Article 11 says, beneficent provisions to the poor, the unfortunate, and the orphan is one of the first duties of a civilized and Christian state. Interesting, isn't it? The Constitution says we're not civilized unless we center the poor, unless we center the unfortunate, unless we center the children and the orphans. So when we look at things from this perspective, whether biblical morality, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or whether we look at constitutional morality, we must declare the same urgency today. If we ever needed to vote for democracy and justice, we sure do need to vote now. Think for a moment about the time in which we are living here today. As we listen at this live stream, as we gather in sanctuaries, we are today 403 years since the first ship landed in Virginia to bring slaves. Today, it's 252 years since Crispus Attucks was the first African American and the first American to die fighting for this country. 240 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's a flaw. That they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their power and consent from the government, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. 235 years since black folk were fractionized in that very Constitution that said all men are created equal. 234 years since the Constitution was adopted, which in spite of the glaring and damning contradictions laid down a hopeful preamble that advocates and freedom fighters would grab onto time and time again and put before America as a miracle, as a mirror. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Here we are, 173 years since Harriet Tubman escaped slavery, 165 years since Frederick Douglass declared, after a stacked, racist, slave-holding Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision that black people had no rights in which white people were bound to respect. It was against that backdrop that Frederick Douglass said, the whole history of the anti-slavery movement is studied with proof that all measures devised and executed with a view to allay and diminish the anti-slavery agitation has only served to increase, intensify, and embolden that agitation. Here we are, 153 years since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, 157 years since the end of the Civil War, 154 years since the 14th Amendment that established equal protection under the law for all people, 152 years since the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which prohibited the federal government and each state from denying and or abridging a citizen's right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Here we are, 124 years since the 1898 riots and massacre and insurrection in Wilmington, North Carolina, designed to stop black and white progressive fusion political power in order to take back the country from what racists saw as the sin of freedom and justice for all. And after 1898, you had the 1898 lynching of Frazier B. Baker in South Carolina, the 1898 Phoenix election riots near Greenwood County, South Carolina, and on and on and on. Here we are, 68 years since Brown versus Board of Education declared separate but equals and unconstitutional. Today, as we sit here we sit 67 years since the brutal murder of Emmett Till, 61 years since Dr. King said to the AFL-CIO and all of its union affiliates that the only voting bloc that could transform America would be for blacks and labor and poor whites and Latinos and Native Americans to learn how to work together and vote together. Here we are tonight, 58 years since Fannie Lou Hamer said, there comes a time when you get sick and tired of being sick and tired. Here we are, 59 years since the murder of Medgar Evers, 59 years since the March on Washington, 59 years since the bombing of 4 girls in a Birmingham church, that instead of tearing the movement apart, made the movement come out even stronger. For Dr. King declared at their funeral, even in their death, these daughters speak to us. Here we are, 58 years since the signing of the Civil Rights Act, 57 years since Bloody Sunday, 57 years since the Voting Rights Act, and the Selma to Montgomery, when on the last day, Martin Luther King stood on the steps of the Alabama State House and said, here is history that you need to know and why people are fighting us so hard. They segregated Southern minds in the 1800s from honest thinking, and they segregated the Negro from everything. That's what happened. That's why segregation happened. It happened when the Negro and white masses of the South, the poor of those masses, threatened to unite and build a great society, a society of justice where none would prey upon the weakness of others, a society of plenty where greed and poverty would be done away with, a society of brotherhood where every man would respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Here we are tonight, 58 years since my parents came back to the South to fight to integrate public schools with multiple college degrees, and yet they did not have protected voting rights. The point is that the very fact that we are facing some of the same extremism and the same battles over the same turf, voting rights, wages, poverty, women's rights, is even more a reason that we must understand if we ever needed to vote for democracy and justice, we surely need to vote now. But it's not just the past history, it's the present pain. As we sit here today, there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this nation. 43% of our entire nation, 52% of our children live within $500 of economic ruin in the wealthiest country in the world. As we sit here, as we listen, 87 million people right now are either uninsured or underinsured. As we sit here right now, we spend 53 cents of every discretionary dollar in the government on the war economy, and less than 16 cents on the kinds of programs that would lift people out of poverty. As we sit here tonight, 1/3 of all poor people live in the South, 1/3 of all poor white people live in the South, and yet the politicians that often vote the most against living wages and health care and insurance come from this area. Here we are, we sit here tonight, there's not a county, not one in the entire country where a person working at a minimum wage job of $7.25 can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. As we sit here, we listen here tonight, it's been 12 years since we have raised the minimum wage. 2009 was the last time we raised the minimum wage. As we sit here tonight, actually 2010, so it's been 13 years. As we sit here tonight, housing is hard for millions. Millions of people are facing evictions. As we sit here, we listen here tonight, 50 million people work every day and make less than a living wage of $15 an hour. As we listen tonight, restaurant workers are going to work and they make $2.13 an hour plus taxes. Their poverty is not their personal failure. Their poverty is the result of policies. And all this is going on while we have watched over the last 3 years during COVID billionaires make $2 trillion while 8 million more people fell into poverty. We gave child tax credits to poor children and their families, lifted them out of poverty for 6 months, snatched it away from them, dropped them right back into poverty. As we sit here tonight, women's reproductive rights have been taken, which will hurt poor women the most, and we'll turn around and give poor women another death fight, because 700 people already die a day from poverty. 250,000 people a year die from poverty. And now with the snatching away of a woman's right to her body, we are saying that rape has more power over her body than she does. Incest has more power over her body than she does. And if she might die, death has more power over her body than she does. Before the pandemic, there were 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. That represents 60% of black people, 26 million people. 64% of Hispanic, 38 million people. 60% of indigenous people, native, 2.15 million. 40% of Asian people, 8 million. And 33% of white people, 66 million. And the majority of poor people are white and women, 73 million women. And in North Carolina, 48% of all the people in North Carolina are poor and low wealth. Notice I didn't say black people or white people, brown people. 48%, almost 50% of all the people in North Carolina. That's 4.7 million people in this state. 56% of our children, 1.3 million. 49% of our women, 2.5 million. 62% of people of color, 2.3 million. 39% of white people, 2.4 million. In North Carolina, almost 181,000 veterans have incomes below $35,000. The people we send into war now use underpasses for strange kinds of hotels. 25% of all of North Carolina's veterans population are poor and or low wealth. 1 million people in this state are uninsured. 32% of the census tracts in this state are at risk for being unable to afford water. 9,000 people are homeless. In North Carolina, you have to, even though our minimum wage is a tad bit higher than the federal minimum wage, you still have to work 87 hours a week, 87 hours a week, to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. And there are million workers in this state who make less than $15 an hour. That means 47% of all of our workers, 49% of all of our workers make less than a living wage. And 1.1 million people participate in food stamps and supplemental income. The pandemic did not create poverty. The pandemic spread it. The pandemic opened it up. The pandemic revealed it. It showed what racism and poverty was doing more clearly. Now, the Economic Policy Institute said in one writing that it put out, that if America does not address what's happening with visionary social and economic policy, the health and well-being of the nation is at stake. If poor and low-income people, these are the economists talking, the economists are saying, if poor and low-income people don't vote and determine who is in office, if poor and low-wealth people and their advocates and moral leaders do not vote and determine who's in office, and policymakers don't change course from one-shot policy activism, we will face even greater economic peril, because the reality is not to address the issue of poverty is morally indefensible, constitutionally inconsistent, politically inept, and economically insane. What we need, even the economists are saying, is not to ask the question, how much does it cost to fix poverty, but how much does it cost for it to stay as it is? What we need is long-term economic policy that establishes justice, promotes the general welfare, and rejects decades of austerity and builds strong social programs that lift society from the bottom. The economic shock of COVID-19, far beyond has had a shock greater than the 2008-2009 Great Recession and even the Great Depression in some ways. Workers were facing extreme economic distress and insecurity before COVID. And then their titles were changed to force them to have to go to work. You do know that that's why we suddenly call people essential workers. It was a name change to institute a policy that forced people to have to go to work. They couldn't shut down, they couldn't quit, just like airplane pilots. Because prior to COVID, we called them service workers. But prior to COVID, they were already in trouble. They were not paid enough to build up a savings. They lacked paid sick medical leave and health insurance. Many of them lacked access to unemployment insurance, affordable options for high-quality child care. They lacked power and a voice at work through unions. They lacked living wage. Even though at the March on Washington in 1963, the March for Jobs and Freedom, the demand then was $2 an hour. They said at the March on Washington, America needs to pay $2 an hour minimum wage. If you adjust that based on inflation, that would be $15 today. So we're 59 years still behind schedule. Universal health care. We're the only of the 25 richest industrialized nations in the world that links people's health care to their job and not to their humanity. In other words, what we say is if your job says you should have health care, you can have it, but you don't deserve health care as a human right. And because I could go further, because of these realities, that's why we have 87 million people without health care. Because we've not addressed these issues, the issue of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, the devastation of our climate, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. Because we have not addressed these issues, that's why we have today 87 million people without health care, 4 million people that can get up every morning and buy unleaded gas, can't buy unleaded water. That's why we have a filibuster that will block the majority from doing what is right for the people. And that's why we have seen so much political violence. Not like we've never seen before, but just like we have seen before, in order to try to hold on to extremism and racism and inequality. But even beyond that, there's some cost to all of this foolishness. The fact that we don't fix it, as Amos said, as Jesus said, as the Constitution says, the fact that we have not fixed these issues, we lose $1 trillion every year in this country from costs for child poverty. We lose $2.6 trillion every year of lost earnings from gender and racial wage gaps. We've lost $1.3 trillion in government revenue because we lowered the corporate tax rate. In 2017 alone, it will cost $6.4 trillion in endless wars. That's what we have spent in endless wars. And inaction on climate change may ultimately cost us $3.3 trillion annually. And we cannot have a Band-Aid approach to these issues. And 250,000 people die every year from poverty. That means refusal to address poverty and the issue of poor folk is a form of policy murder. 700 people were alive yesterday that are not alive today, not because it was their time to go home, but because they succumbed to the suffocating realities of poverty. And the Economic Policy Institute says, absent a radical policy change, there is a very good chance that these unnecessary losses and trillions in losses and human beings will continue. And inequality and inequity will worsen. Even though we may celebrate a few steps here and there, ultimately we will not have the fundamental change, which is why we must resist calls for normalcy. We do not need genteel politics which cover up gross inequality. We need respect, yes, but not respect on the outside for the cameras, while we disrespect and pass policies that undermine people's lives and refuses to address poverty. Nobody should tell us to be quiet. I remember William Lord Garrison during the days of slavery. I remember him through reading, and somebody questioned him, said he was not moderate enough in his language, Brianna. And he said, I will be as harsh as truth requires. He said, on this subject, I do not wish to think or to write or to speak with moderation. No. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Go tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of a ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But do not urge me to be moderate in the cause like the one that we face in the present. I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch. I will be heard. Because there's some things we can't compromise. We can't compromise on saving this democracy. We can't compromise on voting rights. We can't compromise on basic living wages and health care. Compromise is what got us in trouble in this country. Compromising is what allowed slavery to exist so long. Compromise is what kept women without the right to vote. Compromising the humanity of people. Compromising. Compromising is why most people in this country didn't get Social Security when it was first bad. Because in 1935, when Roosevelt passed the Social Security Act, in order to get it passed, he had to compromise with people who didn't even vote for it. They didn't even vote. They said to him, look, we'll only possibly think about voting for this if you make sure that black people and brown people and women can't get in the system. We don't want our women to get too uppity. We don't want black and brown people to have it. And so they decided that the first Social Security, the compromise was we're going to pass it, but if you work in the farming community, the agriculture community, or you work in the domestic community, you can't buy into it, which meant most black people, most brown people, and 50% of even white women did not get it until 1954. This is not a time in America for peaceful negligence. Now, it also is not a time for violence. It's not a time for violent insurrections. It's also not a time for scared resignation. It's time for a moral resurrection. This is the time to expose the divide, the lies and the myths that have kept America from addressing the needs of the poor and the sick and the least of these. We need to expose the lie that we don't have the money. We've got the money. We need to show where the money is and lift people to have what they need in health care and living wages and guaranteed incomes. We need to teach and show that the future of this country is tied up in us not passing an unnecessary tax cuts for corporations and treating corporations like people and people like things. But the reality is we need to treat people like people, and policy needs to reflect that. Which is why on June 18th, people from all over this country, poor and low wealth, and their advocates said we won't be silent anymore. Yes, we must demand living wages, and then we must push back on anybody that says it's socialism. It's not socialism, it's social justice. It's social justice for 100 million people, nearly 100 million people without health care to get it. It's social justice for millions of people who make less than a living wage to get it. Maybe it's time to not compromise with those who have worked and fought so hard against justice. Maybe it's time to expose that the same person that cries socialism today cried socialism about Social Security, cried socialism about the Fair Labor Act, cried socialism about union. They've always done it. They call Martin Luther King, Fannie Lou Hamer socialist. It's not new, it's an old language. When Jesus says to feed the hungry and give water to the thirsty, they would call him a socialist, but it's not socialism, it's justice, it's Jesus, it's morality. And maybe it's time to stop compromising with these attitudes and expose them with the hope that some will see the truth. And so if you love justice, you can't be at peace with injustice. If you love good, you can't be at peace with bad. If you love truth, you can't be at peace with lies. If you love mercy, you can't be at peace with meanness. If you love and respect all people, you can't be at peace with racism. And if you love God, you can't be at peace with the false gods of greed and racism and hatred. And so when you look at it from this perspective, in the reality of our present pain, if we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote for democracy now. All the southern states are over 40% poor and low wealth, if we ever needed to vote. Most of the politicians that vote to cut taxes on the wealthy and raise taxes on the poor and refuse labor rights and refuse living wages come out of the South. If we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. We need to vote because of the way Congress and our own state legislatures have attacked voting power. In 2013, Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court case gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Since then, 23 states have adopted some form of voter suppression, and today 50 million Americans have less access to the polls than they had in 2020 if we ever needed to vote. We need to vote now because there are those who want to give windfalls to billionaires and inflict more pain on the poor. If we ever needed to vote, we need to vote now. We see politicians that pander to bigots and race baiting, those who have been forced to try to find any way they can to stay where they are. Never in history have we seen so much money being spent to resist equality. One writer calls it a dollarocracy. The gross sums of money being spent to take us backwards is lewd, it's pornographic, it's blatant, it's arrogant. These are troubling times. Banks get bailouts, corporations get bailouts. Poor and low wealth people get turned on. These are critical times. And if we ever need to vote, we sure do need to vote for justice and democracy now. So I don't know if Republicans are going to show up in November. I don't know if Democrats are going to show up, but I know there's poor and low wage and low wealth people. We better show up. And advocates, we better show up. We don't need, as I said, an immoral insurrection. We do not need pessimistic resignation. We need a moral and engaged resurrection and a third reconstruction. Poverty is a result of policy. The denial of health care is a result of policy. Undermining women's protection is a result of policy. And if these are all matters of policy, we must vote to change who makes the policy. And if we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. Every person needs to contact somebody. Van, bus, car, mule and cart if you got it. Every group, every organization, everybody. Think about it. With less, Harriet Tubman got 500 slaves out of slavery. She didn't have email. She didn't have texting. She didn't even know what Twitter was. She didn't have a car. She had faith in God, moss on the north side of a tree and a North Star in the middle of the night. And she did more with less. Our parents did more with less, with less, with less. They became abolitionists. With less, they beat slavery. With less, they beat Jim Crow. With less, they beat lynching. With less, they beat the KKK. With less, they turned this country away from its chauvinism when it came to voting and fought and demanded and won women's suffrage. With less, black, white, brown people through history won labor rights, and we must do more with more. So from now until November, email everybody you know and tell them to show up. Because if we ever needed to vote for democracy and justice, we need to vote now. Text everybody you know, tell them to show up. Snapchat them, Instagram them, FaceTime them, Facebook them, knock on the doors, go to the churches, go to the hood, go to the pool shops, wherever people are, go to the beauty parlor, wherever people are, and tell them this is not about personality and parties, it's about policy and principles. And that poor and low wealth people now represent 30% of the electorate in this country and 45% in battleground states. In North Carolina, poor and low wealth people represent over 47% of the electorate. That's power, and we cannot let it stay home. I know that sometimes poor and low wealth people we've met say, well, we don't vote because nobody talks about us. Well, if they don't talk about you, make them talk about you. Show up. They're not factoring you in when they say how the midterms are going on. They're not talking about, but they're expecting people to stay home. We know in this state alone, if just 19% of the thousands of poor and low wealth people that didn't vote in the last election, not 20%, 30%, 40%, if 19% would vote, that's somewhere around 150, 160,000 people out of about 700,000. If they would just vote around policies, they could determine who gets elected, because there's not one elected offices where the margin of victory was more than 19% of the poor and low wealth people who are already registered to vote, who are already eligible. And so if we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. And since I'm a preacher, let me remind you that whenever we do what we're supposed to do, the divine shows up. Whenever we do what we're supposed to do, God blesses our efforts. God always has, God always will. When we work our faith, miracles and movement show up. Faith is what you believe about God, about the divine, but works is what you do because of what you believe. That's why faith without works is just as dead and destitute and devoid as anything you've ever seen. But faith with work, when a people decide that they're not going to sit on the gifts and the power and the graces that the divine has given them, then that's dynamic and can change destiny. And whenever we work our faith, God shows up. When Moses just stretched out his rod, God showed up. The wind came down, the Red Sea opened up, Pharaoh was brought down, and they marched through the Red Sea. When they just marched around Jericho, God showed up and the walls fell down. When David threw his rock, God showed up. Goliath came down, found out the bigger they are, the harder they small. When Daniel went in the lion's den, God showed up, the lions calmed down. When Esther went to see the king, God showed up, evil plans were turned around. When a woman touched the hem of his garment, God showed up, blood disease slowed down. When a boy gave the Lord fish and 5 loaves, God showed up and a buffet came down. When Jesus went to the cross, God showed up, Satan's kingdom was torn down. Early Sunday morning, resurrection happened and the angels had a Holy Ghost throwdown. When Thurgood Marshall went to the Supreme Court and America's segregation was brought down. When Rosa Parks sat down, a movement stood up and Jim Crow had to step down. And if we vote, if we engage, if we build movements, if we speak up and vote up and stand up and organize up, every time we put our faith and our works together, evil is shut down and God shows up. And so the time is now. If we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. And so let me claim one of the great hymns of the movement. Why don't we decide in this moment that we're not going to have pessimistic resignation, but we're going to be a moral resurrection. And we're going to sing the anthem of the Moral Monday movement. Go out and tell the story. Let it echo far and wide. make them hear you. Make them hear you how justice was our battle and how justice was denied. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. And say to those who blame us for the way we choose to fight that sometimes there are battles that are more than black and white, and I could not put down my sword when justice was my right. Make them hear you. Go out and tell the story to your daughters and your sons. Make them hear it. Tell them in our struggle we were not the only ones. Make them hear you. Your sword can be a sermon, or a vote, or a pen, or a ballot box, or a meeting. But whatever it is, don't put it down. Teach every child to raise his voice and make them hear us. If we ever needed to vote for justice and democracy, we sure do need to vote now. God bless you. As we come now to this part of our live stream, we have 3 witnesses and 1 live stream after the 3 live that are going to share their stories. They've decided to pick up their sword. They're voting. They're not going to resign. They're telling their story, and from their perspective, why they must vote. Not about party, not about people, but about positions and policies. And so I want to invite Brianna Kemp to come and introduce them now. And you receive them all over this country and all over the state through live stream. God bless you.
Good evening. I'm Brianna Kemp. I'm a national organizer with Repairers of the Breach, and it is my honor to introduce tonight just a few of the leaders here in North Carolina who are organizing and building this movement day in and day out, making sure that people get to the polls and fighting every day to build a movement and fight for a more just society where everyone can thrive. So now you're going to hear from Sage Smith, then from Denisha Rogers, and then from Sherry White Williamson, and after that, a call to action on how you can get involved.
Hi, my name is Sage. I'm here to tell my abortion story. So when I was 17, I had just turned 17, and I was living with my neglectful dad and my abusive stepmom when my pregnancy test came back positive, and I knew immediately that I wanted an abortion. I knew that there was no way with my living situation at the time and my physical, emotional, or financial state that I would be able to take care of both myself and a child. Choosing abortion was the easiest part of my decision. The hardest part of my endeavor was the variety of barriers ranging from mandatory biased counseling that tried to talk me out of my decision, a 3-day waiting period, living 2 hours away from the closest clinic, having to make multiple visits to the clinic, using all of my savings from working my minimum wage job, and the shame and stigma from the people that I told that were important to me. This was 4 years before Roe v. Wade was overturned. Abortion access is vital to reproductive health care because there is no choice when there is no access. When abortion access is restricted, it disproportionately hurts young folks, poor people, and the BIPOC community the most. Every restriction, barrier, and delay adds cost to an already difficult process. These extra costs are hardships that fall the hardest on people who are already struggling to pay for an unexpected abortion. People deserve to choose if and when they want to have children and should be able to parent their children in safe environments. Abortion is still legal up to 20 weeks in North Carolina, but we must vote this November to ensure that it remains legal and to remove the current barriers that exist. With North Carolina being a swing state, that makes our votes have even more weight since these midterms will determine our very future. We deserve policies that protect abortion, fund local clinics, support families and individuals, and lets people know that they're trusted to make decisions about their own lives. Thank you.
Thank you. If we ever needed to vote, we sure do. Need to vote. For democracy.
For democracy.
And justice.
And for justice.
Now.
Hello, my name is Denisha Rogers, and I want you to know somebody's been hurting my children, and it's gone on far too long, and I'm not gonna be silent anymore. I have 5 children with mental health issues. Some are more worse than others, autism and different things. Being that I'm a single mom, I work 3-4 jobs at a time, and I'm in school 16 credit hours. They have mental health issues, and I call on Medicaid. They're supposed to provide us with resources and health care. To get basic mental health needs, psychiatric needs, you have to, with the new thing in North Carolina, you got to go to the pediatrician. That take about a month to get in. Then they want to send you a referral 6 to 8 weeks to come. Then the psychiatrist want to put you out for 2 more months. If you're dealing with bipolar, schizophrenia, or different type of things, in that time, so much can happen. Tragic, suicide, anything. So with this thing, with Medicaid and everything else, I'm fighting for my children. I'm going to continue to fight. Whether CPS come, they want to take your children, then make them worse than what they was before they even took them. Then they give them back to you and tell them, here you go, fix it, like it's something you could just put a Band-Aid over. It's not worth it, and I'm going to stand and fight every time poor people campaign tell me to get out here. I'm going to fight, I'm going to fight, I'm going to vote, I'm going to vote. As we say, forward together, one step back.
Forward together.
Not one step back. Forward together.
Not one step back.
Good evening. I'm Sherry White Williamson. I am the one of the organizers of the Environmental Justice Community Action Network in Sampson County, North Carolina. And I'm here to tell you that water is a human right. We don't have water. We don't have safe water in Sampson County. We have more hogs in Sampson County than we have people. Wow. 33 hogs per person in Sampson County. And because of that, and because we have so many people on well water, we don't even know when people are drinking water that's unsafe for them to drink, that's harming their children, harming themselves. We have a church in Sampson County that we've been working with, Mount Zion AME Zion Church. That church had to dig a well that was from 20 feet to 250 feet to find safe water. They were told they could not drink the water in the church because of the nitrates in the water. The nitrates are coming from a hog farm that's behind the church. And there's denial about who is responsible for that nitrates. It's a human right. We don't have that human right. We don't have infrastructure, and these folks need infrastructure. We're fighting every day to make sure that everybody has safe, affordable water and don't have to worry about buying bottled water just to know that they're drinking something that's safe. We need to vote. We need to make sure that people like the people that we work with every day are free to drink the water that's safe for them, that they don't have to worry about they're going to end up with children with blue baby syndrome. North Carolina is one of the few places that has children that have blue baby syndrome because of their exposure to the nitrates that they have in the water. We've got to do something, and the only way we can do it if we vote and change the way things are. If we'd ever needed to vote for democracy and justice, we sure do need to vote now.
Amen.
And now we'll see a brief video from a Fight for 15 worker who spoke in Washington, D.C. on June 18th.
How y'all doing? My name is Beth Schaefer. I'm with Raise Up, Charleston Fight for 15, and a union. I have been struggling to pay my bills since I've been working at 16 years old. I work full-time at KFC and a second job at a gas station. I work 64 hours a week, 7 days a week. I am exhausted. Yes. My wages are so low that I'm facing eviction every month. Eviction would mean that me and my disabled father would be homeless. I know I'm not alone. There are so many people who work for billion-dollar companies and still end up homeless. Why? Because the federal is sentencing us to poverty. My home state of South Carolina is like the rest of the South and the Midwest. Our minimum wage has not gone up in 13 years. Our government is catering to corporate greed, and us workers are paying the price. And it's disproportionately black and brown workers, especially women of color, who are carrying the burden of minimum wage in this country. So we demand that our government raise federal minimum wage to at least $15 an hour. We demand that our government pass the PRO Act and make it easier for workers to form unions, because we need a collective voice on our jobs. Low-wage workers, we run this country. It's our labor that creates wealth. We have so much power than we realize. When we organize, we have the power to change this country. So keep organizing and keep fighting.
That's right. We're going to keep organizing and mobilizing this election season, because if we ever needed to vote for justice and democracy, we sure do need to vote now. My name is Siggy Melis. I'm the National Co-Director of Organizing for Repairers of the Breach. In this election season, we're going to stir up some moral energy here in North Carolina and vote for the issues. We're going to do 3 simple things all across North Carolina. We're going to make sure that we're registered to vote. We're going to make sure that we have a plan to vote. And we're going to make sure that our family, our friends, our neighbors, our communities are registered and also have a plan to vote. So we're going to make sure that folks know how to do that tonight, and how to do that in North Carolina. You can register to vote online at ncdot.gov. You can register to vote by mail or in person on ncsbe.gov. The registration deadline to register to vote is 25 days before Election Day. That's by 5 p.m. Friday, October 14th. You can also register to vote by mail by the 25 days before Election Day. And also in North Carolina, there is same-day registration available during the early voting period. And why is this important? Like Bishop said earlier tonight, almost 40% of eligible North Carolina voters are poor, low wealth, and low wage. And over 80% of them are already registered. But hundreds of thousands of voters did not turn out to vote in 2020. 35.63% of eligible low-income voters did not turn out to vote in 2020. So we're going to speak out with our vote this election season. Our votes are not the support of an individual person, but the issues that matter to us most. There aren't just candidates on the ballots, our issues are on the ballot. And our opportunity now in 2022, this November, is to turn out the largest number of poor and low wealth people in North Carolina. I'm going to turn it over to Brianna, an organizer with Repairers of the Breach. She's going to tell you how we're going to turn out the vote in North Carolina and how to sign up to get involved.
All right, movement family, we know that for the next 2 months, we have to get in the streets and on the phones, getting people ready to vote. Make sure people are registered and make sure they have a plan and that they're aware of what the issues are and the candidates and what they stand for. So there's going to be a few things that we can all do together here in North Carolina over the next 8 weeks. And when you sign up, you're going to get more information after tonight about how to join in these different efforts. First, we're going to have 2 coordinated statewide canvassing days. We're going to have nationally coordinated text banks where we can text tens of thousands of people in a short period of time and make sure that they have the information they need to register and to figure out where they should vote. And then we're going to support efforts all around the state where people want to canvass in their own communities, door knock, make sure your neighbors are registered, make sure people in your congregation are registered, make sure people that shop at your local grocery store are registered. So what we need you to do tonight is to sign up so that we can send you more information on how to get involved in each of these things. So there's two ways you can do that. You're going to see a link on your screen to do it online, or you can send a text. You can text VOTE, V-O-T-E, or MORAL, M-O-R-A-L, to 38542. You can text VOTE or MORAL to 38542. And I'm looking forward to seeing many of you out on the streets and on the phones in North Carolina over the next couple of months.
Not one step back. Forward together.
Not one step back.
Forward together.
Not one step back.